Good morning. This is a cavernous room. Why don't we come forward a bit? I'm not ashamed. Let's do it. Make this a bit more intimate. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me well? See, I like the intimacy. Here's what we're going to do. I want to first acknowledge that last week, Thursday, I was in Minneapolis, and the high was 8. And so I'm stunningly appreciative of being here today. So that said, here's what I want to do. I would like to make the case for what citizenship looks like in this modern economy. We have, as you know, a changing landscape of what American work looks like, of the kind of educational infrastructure that's necessary to be able to play in that space. So the thesis that I'm going to have is essentially that the way that citizenship works in the modern, contemporary American structure requires an element of computational, of STEM education to be able to play. That's the central thesis. So typically when you do these things, you have to say exactly what you're going to say, then say it, and then repeat what you said in the beginning so everybody knows exactly what you said. So I'm just telling you now that that's my thesis. We good? Everybody with me? All right. So the first question is, who is a citizen? And I don't mean this at all in the litigious sense, but the way that the country is operating at the moment, that question is central. Who are the citizens? And in my interpretation of that, all I really mean is that it's the set of people who coexist, and therefore we have mutual responsibilities to each other. And I'm not making the case as it being a grand legal challenge of what that is. Clearly, we're under a state of emergency at the moment. There are questions about the legitimacy of building a wall to keep people out. So the presence of human beings, whether they can exist in one place or another, is fundamentally under question at the moment. I just happen to personally feel that the mere fact that we are here makes the case that we have to be responsible to each other. That's my personal view of what citizenship means. The next part of this is the Technopolis. What is a Technopolis? And again, in my view, here's the story that's going to kind of go through this process. Atlanta, where I'm from, is where I live. I'm from New York, where we were one of the 20 finalists for the Amazon second headquarters. As you well know, that was a huge national spectacle. New York revolted the other day, and now they're not going to New York, they're going to stay in DC. So that whole process was complicated at its root. But what it did do is it demonstrated what a technopolis is. All of the major American cities, every single one of them, made proposals to have this headquarters come to their city. And Amazon notwithstanding, it doesn't really matter, but the kind of company that they represent is essentially what we're talking about. So when cities, municipal leaders, and economic development officers are making their pledges to companies like Amazon, they're projecting to them and to the cities themselves, what is it exactly that our economy will be based on in the future? And second to that is, who are the people that will be able to partake in that economy? So the second theme of this is that we have to be able to determine who those people actually are. That's central to this problem. So now let me use Atlanta as an example of some of the challenges that we're actually facing. Again, the theme here is that we have to conceive of a way of citizenship that includes a certain type of education. That's the concern that I have, and who gets left in and who gets left out. That's the fundamental question. So there's some things here that I want to share with you. I realize that typically we're not supposed to use like in these kinds of presentations, supposed to have pithy slides, but there's some data that I want to share with you. So bear with me for a moment. Atlanta is the second most segregated city in the United States behind Chicago. These are things that you probably know, but I want to show it to you so you can see what it looks like in fact. The way that this is laid out is essentially, I won't go into the complications of it, but basically blue is where the principal white communities are. Those are census tracts. And brown is where black people live in Atlanta. And everything in Atlanta is correlated with that degree of segregation. The kind of education that you get, the opportunities for employment, whether you have transportation or not, whether you have sidewalks or not, your access to health care, the degree to which you are prosecuted by police, all of it is connected to that. In the last mayoral election, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottom won by 700 and some change votes. In the previous election, Mayor Kasim Reed won by a similar amount of votes. And those voting percentages followed that path exactly. Everything is correlated with that degree of segregation. So I want to set the stage about the relationship between the racial and ethnic segregation in a major American city like Atlanta and the correlation to citizenship. This is a central problem. Austin is not exempt, but I'm a guest, so I don't want to talk about Austin directly, because you might question my authenticity. But here's the deal. I know it's true, and everybody is facing the same challenge. So what does that mean? Let me show you again. Forgive me with some of the details here, but I want to show you on this slide. Don't worry about all the numbers. Basically, we have about 11 regular public schools in Atlanta. We have a whole host of charter schools. That kind of indicts the problem that I'm talking about too, because whether charter schools are viable, whether they're public or not, whether they're siphoning off students or not, all of that is its own discussion. I'm not getting into that right now. But the regular public schools, the kinds that, judging by what you look like and your age, the kinds that we went to, we have 11 of them. There are 8 where there are no white students at all in Atlanta. So it could be that we have those 8 schools that says for coloreds only. That could be the sign, and you would be accurate, just as if it was the case in 1954. That level of segregation is extraordinary in Atlanta public schools. I happen to know that it's equally true in other cities too, as you well know. I don't need to list chapter and verse of the data. You know it instinctively. But I want to show it to you so that it's clear. There are 3 schools where white kids go, only 3. And in those schools, that segregation, it manifests itself within the schools. As you also know, for those of you who have children, when you're sending your kids to do the advanced placement courses, or you want them in the International Baccalaureate program, or you want them in the honors program, or you want them in the travel program, or you want them in the science program, all of the things that are indicators of success that enable you to elevate to the next level of post-secondary education, that's where you'll find the preponderance of white kids, and Asian kids as well. So that level of segregation is fundamental to who gets access to the kind of education that will make them viable for the kind of economic landscape that will make them citizens. You follow my train of thought? I want to show you the data so you can see it. Because this thing surprises people in Atlanta who live there. They have no idea that it's this degree of segregation. This is what we're living with day to day. And the kids themselves know it. So here's our challenge. When Atlanta made the case to Amazon that we were going to be the kind of city that demonstrates the landscape that makes it marketable, profitable, and the kind of place that Amazon would want to come to, what did we say to them? We said to them that we have the workforce, transportation notwithstanding, because the transportation in Atlanta is terrible, but we have the workforce that would make it something that you would want to be, you would find attractive. And what does that really mean? So when the Amazon HQ folks came to Atlanta, as they did to all cities, because if you remember that whole process, the way that it worked, they were very secretive about what the jobs were. But they did say that those kinds of occupations were very highly skilled, high-tech jobs. They promised Atlanta that there were going to be 50,000 jobs, all of whom had north of $100,000 salaries. That's significant. So if you're an economic development officer for a city, any city, you're clamoring after that. So this is a complicated problem. The cities need that kind of economic engine and development. But it also, they didn't say what those jobs actually were. They just said that they're high-tech, I can quote you chapter and verse, but basically high-tech STEM jobs. So what does that mean exactly? So because they wouldn't say, I took it upon myself to look for a job at Amazon's H1. And again, I'm only using this as a proxy. I'm not trying to indict Amazon particularly. This is true of all companies in that caliber. In the H1 job, they had this job called data analyst. And this data analyst job seems relatively innocuous. So I looked it up. And what did it say? First, you had to have, at a minimum, you had to have a master's in computer science. The next thing was a PhD was preferred. So I don't know about y'all, but I don't really know that many people that have a PhD in computer science. And typically when you have it on job applications, the preference is, proficient in Spanish, or maybe you've used some kind of Microsoft Excel or whatever. It's not preferable that you have a PhD in computer science. There's a whole different level of this kind of work. So the question then becomes, who are the people that actually have that kind of education? So if the city is projecting and claiming to Amazon, to Google, to Intel, to Microsoft, to PayPal, let's distribute this, that we have the workforce that is necessary for you to be successful in this city. And we also know that we have a whole segment of our population that doesn't have that kind of education. We're projecting a future without those people. Hence the problem. The relationship between the kind of education that we're offering to the citizens of the city and whether we project for their presence in the future. The reason that I wanted to show this, I'm affiliated with Georgia Tech as well. I run a center there called the Constellation Center for Equity in Computing. And the whole point of that is to build the infrastructure for computing education to exist in Atlanta such that we can have parts of the city be viable to be citizens. That's the objective. I'm not confused by all this STEM stuff. They treat STEM as if it's a thing that you can buy these days. Like everybody's like, oh, you know some STEM and you can get your coding here and your STEM there. It's like you can sell it. Let me just give you some STEM and so on, whatever. I don't really buy all that. I'm concerned about people's ability to live. The STEM thing is a path towards that end. The wherewithal that we have, the ability to have the kind of educational infrastructure in our schools and our daily lives that makes you capable to participate in that larger economy, that's what I'm after. And that larger economy, the way that I'm operationalizing Technopolis, is that. And also let me be clear, just because we have this opportunity to dialogue a bit, that I'm not, notwithstanding what I do, I also am not blinded by the way that we're treating STEM education. We treat it as if that's the gold standard. The rest of education doesn't matter. You don't have to read. You don't have to do cultural understanding. You don't have to do history. I don't agree with that on its face. The problem with some of this is that we're treating STEM education as a training ground for workers. We're not educating citizens. Clearly that's lofty and philosophical, but I just wanted to share with you how I believe in it. Part of the problem that we have with the very wall at the center of what we mean and classify citizens and human beings is a misunderstanding of the historical relationship between the United States and Mexico. We don't really understand its history, in part because we haven't treated education in its totality. And one of the dangers here is if we go down this road of STEM education as a training mechanism just for the workforce, we'll have workers and we're not going to have educated people. And those are two different things. Just because we have these fancy degrees like I do doesn't make me an educated person. It makes me the kind that have checked all these boxes. So the reality is that this changing landscape, what I'm showing you in this slide here is the relationship that Georgia Tech has had with its own citizens. For the first time in the Institute's history, there were more Asian students than white students in 2017. Georgia Tech sits geographically in the center of Atlanta Public Schools. Atlanta Public Schools has 52,000 students, nearly 90% of whom are black. The decades worth of information that's here shows you that the infrastructure that we have in the city is not preparing black students who come from Atlanta and from Georgia to be qualified and competitive for an elite institution like Georgia Tech. And be clear again, too, I'm not disparaging other kinds of institutions. I'm talking about the one that I work, where I work. And Georgia Tech was central to the argument that we're using to companies like Amazon. They're not using smaller institutions and technical colleges as the centerpiece for the argument about why you should come to Atlanta. They use Georgia Tech. That kind of institution is the place where some of these demographics matter the most in arguments about the viability of cities. That's the central premise. And what this shows you is that we don't have black kids and Hispanic kids in those institutions. There are 148 black undergraduate students in the College of Computing at the Georgia Institute of Technology in the middle of Atlanta, where 64% of the population is black people in 2000. And since this is National Women's History Month, I'll also have you know that of those black students, only 41 of them are black women. 36 of those Hispanic women. Less than 100 of the female students of color at the Georgia Institute of Technology in the College of Computing. Who are the citizens ultimately going to be? The relationship between this and what I'm saying is central to the way that we're projecting the future of our cities. And the concern that I have about all of this is that it's built into the structure of what we're doing. And the reason that I wanted to be a little data heavy and to show you some of these things is because we can live these lives without being aware of how they're happening. Because more often than not, they don't necessarily affect us, particularly those of us who come to places like this. We have institutions that back our travel. They back our registration. They back our access to coming to other places to be able to learn. But the students who are locked out, their families, they don't get options. They don't have the access to even places like this to come and learn about people who are doing the work that we all do. It's a totally segregated existence. And therein lies part of the challenge that I think that we all have. So what does that really mean? Again, forgive me with the heaviness on the data, but I want to show you some of these things. Because when I discovered it myself, I found it stunning. Obviously, the relationship between college and income is clear. I mean, we don't need to explain that. But I want to show you how it plays out. In the previous chart that I showed you about the segregation, those colors were census tracts. And each census tract that was blue, for example, is a census tract where the population of people was greater than 78% white, less than 7% black. And each census tract that was colored brown is a census tract where the population of people was greater than 68% black and less than 12% white. But I can tell you by lived experience that the reality is that they're much more extreme. In some of those census tracts, there aren't anybody else. They're totally homogenous. Such is the nature of the segregation that we're living in Atlanta. And I also know, just by virtue of having been around, that in the places that you all live, it's the same thing. So what is this saying? This is saying that in each of those census tracts, along the x-axis, what you're finding is the percent of people who have an advanced, a post-secondary degree versus the median household income on the y-axis. So what you'll find with the chart on the left, that's blue, is what you'd expect. That in census tracts where the greater proportion of people have advanced post-secondary degrees, their income goes up. So what you would expect in a natural spectrum of communities of people, some are going to go to college, some aren't, there's going to be kind of a natural flow. And that's what you find on the left. So in those census tracts that are predominantly white, the proportion matches what you would expect. So it's clear. Yes? We're going to be dynamic. I'm not really worried about all the staging and such. Yeah? So, on the right, clearly, given my first explanation, you see the problem. What this is saying is that one lone brown dot that's out there on its own. There is only one census tract in Atlanta where more than 65% of the people are black and more than half have a college degree. There's only one in the entire city. So what that means then is that the concentration of poverty that's connected to the lack of access to the high-end education that makes you viable to be a citizen is reflected exactly in this chart. such that it is abundantly clear, whether you feel that that's people's independent agency or a failure thereof, that's a different discussion as to why people are poor. I'm not having that discussion now. But what I do want to do is to demonstrate irrefutably that the relationship between the kind of education that you get, mind you with the segregation that I showed you before, access to institutions like Georgia Tech, and the outcome of that is this. Just so that we can lay out the logic very clearly. So what is the problem with this? The problem with this was that this was in 2016. In 2000, there were 10 census tracts where the majority of people were black and more than half of them had college degrees. So then the question becomes, what happened to them? What kind of college degrees? Why were they not sticky enough to lay hold in the city? How did they disperse? Those are interesting questions, all of which I don't know the answers to. But what they do is that they demonstrate the migration of people that's happening, and I would argue as a result of the kind of education that people get. So this is the problem, the central problem that we're faced with. So what do we do now? We have a housing challenge here. And I don't want to bleed my theme. Keep in mind my central thesis, that citizenship requires a certain kind of education in a modern technical society. Technopolis is what I'm calling it. So if there's a certain kind of education that you can't get, then you can't be a citizen in the way that I'm defining it as being a viable resident in a particular co-establishment. Yeah? So then what happens? These are also things that you already know. Austin, I have data on it, but because I'm a guest, I'll keep it to myself. Austin, it was all blown up recently because Apple decided to invest another $1 billion and open a huge center here. Google, which I'm affiliated with, is also growing here by leaps and bounds. So the technical infrastructure of Austin is also taking place. And what does that mean? That means all the things that we already know. I mean, those words that we throw around, gentrification, and so on and so forth, right? But here's what this picture demonstrates. In Atlanta, we have this thing called the Beltline. And for those of you who haven't been to Atlanta, you should come because it's beautiful. And what it is, it's a transformed kind of railroad. So it connects all the neighborhoods. It's really, really nice. And it's a centerpiece of our kind of modern urban development, right? All cities have things like this, the kind of cute parks, and then alongside there are all these kind of local things where you can get your non-everything coffee and your non-everything sandwich and so on, right? So I like gluten. Gluten is good, but everybody's like, well, I don't want this and I don't want that, whatever. But you understand the kind of environment that I'm talking about, yes? Okay. So this is the popsicle and the housing price. So popsicle, that particular popsicle, this is a friend of mine's daughter. That particular popsicle costs $4.50 for one popsicle. And it was just lemonade. And I was like, yo, really, for $4.50? They just froze a cup of lemonade and then they charge you $4.50 for it. But meanwhile, we're walking on the Beltline, and what do we see? 19 luxury townhomes with rooftop terrace from the 1.2 M's. So first of all, again, let's close our relationship here and let's be friends. I'm like, yo, really? From the 1.2 M's? I mean, that's insulting. And I was really angry. If you want to say it costs more than $1 million, say that, but don't say from the 1.2 M's like all of you minions who can't afford it, that's not for you. You know what I mean? But clearly that's what they're saying. And so for those of you who have regular jobs like I do, if you work at university, work at a school, if you work at, this is not for you, clearly. If you have a 1.2 M house and you put 10% down, you're paying upwards of $3,800 a month. Let's just break it down to what that actually means. And you have to have a $4.50 popsicle. I mean, so this is where this is all tending. So let me go back to this other point that I was raising earlier. The median household income for black families in Atlanta, $29,000 a year. That slide that I showed you, yes, that slide that I showed you demonstrates that. Atlanta has the largest income disparity of any major American city in the United States. It also has the greatest degree of immutability If you're born poor in Atlanta, the likelihood that you will stay poor is the greatest of any major metropolitan city in the United States. So the disparity between the rich and the poor, the immobility between the rich and the poor, and the segregation between the rich and the poor are stone locked in Atlanta. So what are we doing now? We're saying that we're building homes for from the 1.2 M's. If your household income is $29,000, and there may be 3 or 4 of you living in that house, you don't know what that M stands for. You may not have ever seen it to understand the implications of what $1 million house means. The mathematics of that doesn't compute. If you've worked your whole life and you're getting $10 an hour and $13 an hour and $15,000 and you're operating at a $40,000 salary, you don't understand the implications of $1 million lifestyle. That's kind of a ubiquitous understanding of what reality means as a consequence of the segregation that I'm talking about. And what does that actually do? That's the thing, I argue, that smashes ambition, because people don't really understand what's necessary to move to this other kind of life because they've been totally separated from it their entire life. So where does that leave us? And I hate to be kind of doomsday man, but I just wanted to raise up some of these realities that I think that we're actually facing. So where does it in fact leave us? It leaves us in a difficult spot. This is awkward to talk about in public. So the half-life, for those of you who deal chemistry things and such, the half-life of something is the rate at which its radioactivity becomes half of what it was in the original state. Yeah? So what is the challenge here? The relationship, again, I just want to keep repeating my central thesis because I think it's important. Citizenship, the degree of mutual responsibility that we have to each other, in this particular moment of American history, requires basic kinds of computational skills. I'm not saying that you need to have a computer science degree or anything of that sort. Don't misunderstand me. But I am saying that there's a degree of numeracy and of analytical fluency to do anything in the modern world. And if you don't have that in the new Technopolis, you can't be a viable citizen. All of these things that I've laid out demonstrate the boundaries that are a result of the segregation that's fundamental to the way we're living, at least in Atlanta, but as I said, I can make the case in cities around the country. So what does this mean? And this is a horrible thing to say in public, but like I said, we're kind of close, so let's just be friends about it. The population of Atlanta in 2000, when I got there, just as the city of Atlanta, not Metro Atlanta, just the city, was 64% black people and 31% white people. In 10 years, by the next census in 2010, that 64% had dropped to 52, and the 31% had increased to 38. It was one of the fastest transformations of any city in the country, and it was almost one-to-one, white person replacing a black person. And I'm not, again, just to be clear, I'm not making a pejorative statement about whether that's good or bad. I'm just promoting the evidence to suggest that that's a fact. And in this current environment, facts seem to be whatever you feel like they are. So here's the deal. But the thing is, let's think about what that actually means. It's stunning. And D.C. was a close second, Washington, D.C. And these are cities that have names associated with the people that actually live there. So for those of you who are kind of my age in the Freaknik days, Atlanta was the Black Mecca. D.C. was Chocolate City. Was. Hence the past tense. It's the same as true as in Atlanta. So in 10 years, the black population of Atlanta has decreased by 30,000 people in the city of Atlanta. That's 8 people per day that are leaving the city. And think about, I want to bring these things down to what it actually means. So think about what that means in the context of your children, or on your block, or your kids' friends, or in the very schools that I was talking about in the beginning that are so segregated. If 8 of those kids leave every day, then what is the ultimate end? And why is this happening? What is it that makes a community sticky, such that they can be viable? Again, my theme. The thing that I would argue here that makes communities sticky, so to speak, is the extent to which they have the kind of education that makes them viable, that makes them competitive, that makes them able to enter into this next rung of the new economy such that they can therefore afford to be able to live in a place like this. That's the central challenge. That's the central tenet. So what does that mean? How do we do that? Clearly, we're in the midst of these education wars. We don't really know. I mean, the central problem that we're trying to solve is the relationship between poverty, race, and historical inertia in the country. There's nothing special, novel, or new about that. That's the problem we're trying to solve. So the school choice and the charter schools and the STEM certification, all of these things are tinkering around trying to be innovative around the central problem of the relationship between those historical American artifacts and the way they manifest themselves in our educational system. And let's be clear about who we're now tasked with addressing that. Let's talk for a second about the relationship between the teachers, whose job it is to educate these students, just for a moment. Keep in mind, I don't want to lose track of the theme that I'm on, but I do want to illustrate the challenge that we're actually facing. Los Angeles Unified School District 3 weeks ago on strike. Oakland Unified School District 2 weeks ago on strike. Boulder District on strike. Last year, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Colorado, they've been on strike all over the place. Chicago, when Rahm Emanuel was in the game, remember, he closed half the schools in that city. There was nearly an uproar. So the people that are most tasked with delivering the kind of education that we need for people to be viable in the current economy are fighting for their lives, particularly in school districts that serve the very students that we're actually talking about. It's true in Atlanta, too. But the relationship between those that are tasked with this and this kind of STEM economy is this. The way that now, let me introduce a little bit what I actually do. So my role at Georgia Tech, as I said, is I lead the Center for Equity in Computing. Prior to that, I was a program officer at the National Science Foundation, as they alluded to. So in that capacity, under the Obama administration, President Obama offered the CS for All platform. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but basically he's saying that computer science and computing is the next form of literacy in the centuries coming forward. And therefore, it was incumbent on the American public education system to be able to offer computer science to all students, as you well know. How do we do that? Mayor Bloomberg mandated that all students in New York has the largest public school system in the United States, 1.1 million students in New York City public schools, which is where I went to school. I went to PS 282 and then 239, and then went to Midwood, and New York is all that. So the thing that was interesting about it was, you make that mandate to say that I want 1.1 million students to be able to do computing somewhere between K and 12. 50 million students if we aggregate that to the United States. 3 million teachers. And you mandate they have to be able to do computing. Who? And how? So here's where the resources have gone. We've sunk a ton of resources into teacher professional development, where you can go through the various array of nonprofit organizations to get teacher professional development in computing. And I think that strategy makes sense. But let's think about the limiting variables that kind of create the constraints of the context in which it's taking place. If you have teachers, as we've since learned, when all of these states are going on strike, their triage is to survive, first. Second is, what are they held accountable to? And as we well know, I have colleagues and friends here who are deeply involved in teacher certification and standardization and the accountability infrastructure that is accountable to the state, as you well know: math, English language arts, science. So now we come in with these lofty goals about computing, and they're like, look, I have to keep the lights on. I have to make sure that these kids can add. I have to make sure that these kids can read. And you're telling me about computing? I get it, and I'm interested, and I believe you, but my responsibilities are here. So we have a fundamental problem with the interests of the city, the interests of the country, to make ourselves capable in this new Technopolis and the actual structure that we're faced with. Again, this is not novel. I just want to lay it out clearly, because we often don't just lay the variables out. Which ones are toggleable? Which ones are constants? That's how we tell the students to solve the problem. Read the given, and where are the constants, and what are the things that you're solving for? That's the nature of the problem that we're currently facing. So if we have, last year, 10 states where the teachers were all on strike, 10 went on strike. And we're also asking those very people to be the ones to be most innovative in a curriculum that they're least familiar with, in a context that they don't understand. And let me just give you another example. I want to be abundantly clear. The kind of teacher professional development that we're often offering in basic computing. The basic doesn't really matter here, but it's as if you were to say you're taking an English teacher, and over the summer, in 2 or 3 weeks, with a little stipend, I'm going to turn you into a Spanish teacher. At its face, it makes you chuckle. But that's the national philosophy around transforming teachers into computer science teachers. Just because somebody studies math doesn't make them a proficient computationalist. So if we were to take those who have the minimum amount of aptitude, those who have the interest, those who have the time, that time one is tough. Let's say we go through that whole set of people. Now who are we left with? We're left with the masses of teachers and the masses of students still left who need some access to this particular skill. And what do we do there? How do you take someone whose educational trajectory has not steered them towards computing and make them into viable aqueducts towards computing learning for students? Let's think about it a little bit more practically too. If you are the actual teacher, in many instances, again, I want to raise the point here about the way that we often treat teacher professional development, as if teachers are somehow cogs in this machine. You can just dump something on them and they'll go do it. Like they just get trained and then they go off and make things happen. These are people who have uncertainties and anxieties. You're offering them some new skill that they're not necessarily familiar with. Suppose I was supposed to come up here and talk to you in front of all these fancy lights about something I just didn't understand. I would be nervous and scared, afraid of being humiliated in front of students who are looking to me to learn something. So we're not often considering that. So then what is the challenge? The challenge then becomes, if we were to decide that the strength that many teachers have to offer is their actual relationship with the students in their classes, schools, and communities, but they are not necessarily the single subject matter experts in this particular field, then we have to find a way to augment that. And here too, this is where I think we open the possibilities for what the solution to this problem might be. I disagree at its face with the idea that you want to make something teacher-proof. I don't like the language, I don't like the intonation, I don't like the connotation of it, I don't like it. But I'm conscious of the fact that there are limitations on what people can actually do. So we have to be able to build an infrastructure, taking full responsibility of understanding what the context is and offer the subject matter such that it can be facilitated by people who understand the context in which they're trying to facilitate it. I think ultimately in this particular realm, that's the only solution that we have. So what that means is doesn't just slap things online and expect the students to do it. And I want to say too, just so that you know that I know, that that doesn't work. Particularly for students who are already besieged by the institutions in which they sit, they're not going to sit in front of some computer and learn some language. It's not going to happen. Let's just all be clear. That isn't happening. So then what happens? You still need somebody to hold your hand and be like, look, I believe you can learn this thing. Do it. Make it happen. And we'll do it together. It's not exactly clear what the pedagogical implications of that actually are. We still, as a country, don't know the best way to teach this thing. So there are two sides of this strand. Again, this is the solution part of my basic thesis, that the ability to be a viable citizen hinges on the kind of education that you get, such that you can be viable in a Technopolis. That's my thesis. I'm going to keep restating it. Now what I'm talking about is the way that we actually make that happen. In one sliver. There are a gajillion slivers and problems that we're all challenged with at the country at the moment, but I'm just talking about this one. So here's the question that we have. At the national level, now if I can switch hats all over the place, the idea that the federal muscle would be imparted behind trying to make the case for computing education and funding all of these things, et cetera. The corporate kind of zeitgeist is also doing that. the Googles of the world, the Microsofts of the world, the Intel, Best Buy, et cetera, they're all pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into this effort under ostensibly the argument for diversity. We can get into that in a little dialogue in a minute, and I'll stop here in just a second. But what I wanted to say is that there are two fundamental questions that we're after. One is an empirical question about pedagogy. How do you augment the limitations of teachers in the classroom with skills that they may not have and don't have an incentive to get, frankly, with an infrastructure that they can facilitate? By that I mean, we need to find ways to make computing education subjects. I'm focused specifically on computing right now, but any subject really, because increasingly there's just no incentive to become a teacher. But in computing specifically, if you graduated an undergraduate degree from Georgia Tech in computer science and you're like, am I going to be a teacher? Absolutely not. So that's kind of a cherubic sacrifice you're asking people to make. But what the pedagogical research question is that we're after is, what's the best way to do that? What's the best way to have this kind of hybrid structure so that the subject matter is not the burden of the teacher themselves to be able to master, to deliver to these students? We don't know the answer to that question. So that's kind of a body of research, a body of work, a body of funding that stands on its own. The second question is, what is our collective responsibility in funding? Here implicates the diversity challenge. In many cases, what we're doing is we're going to find a couple black kids wherever. And let me tell you this 2-second story, and then I'll stop. I'm one of those kids. So when you are in my, I was talking to the freshmen at Georgia Tech the other day, and I realized that all of them were born like 2001. I was like, for real? Really? I mean, it's just nuts. Like, we were already at war. I was like, for real? I was already grown. So here's what happened. I went to school in Brooklyn, and I did well, et cetera, et cetera. But in those days, they had all these programs. They're like, oh, we need to find young African-American, and boys in particular. So like, if you could be a brother and do some science, everybody in the world wanted you. Like, oh my God, there he is, get him. And take his picture and make him smile, like he's the one, right? So I've been on a brochure of every school that I've ever been in. And in the beginning, I was like, yo, it's because, I'm a good-looking guy. But it turns out that they wanted to demonstrate that they could, in fact, educate a black man. Cool, because the assumption was that you couldn't. So here I was, this kind of example. And I'm not unique in any way. I'm just using my own story. But the assumption was basically that you couldn't educate people like me. So therefore, when I was educatable, and all of a sudden I've gone to these fancy schools, like I went to the University of California at Berkeley, and I got my PhD at Georgia Tech, and they were like, Jesus Christ, who is this dude? And then they want to know, what did you do? Well, what I did was, I did my homework. And I studied for the test. And I applied when you told me to, and I was on time. There's no magic in that. It's like basic stuff. So the challenge then becomes, if we're thinking about the way that this diversity argument is working, keep in mind what I'm talking about. Don't lose track of my train of thought. We have the pedagogical, empirical questions that have to be answered. That's an entirely fundable mechanism that the country is after at the moment. The second thing is that the correlation between this and the diversity arguments that the country is also making. And diversity arguments tend, the reason I told you that story, they tend to just pluck people. There's a guy, get him. There's a young black woman, get her. But what does that not do? It doesn't deal with the structure, the capacity of the places that those kids go to school. You can pluck them out all day long, but those onesies and twosies exist everywhere. But in order for year after year, generation after generation, cohort after cohort, on the long scheme, the capacity has to change. Otherwise, you can just keep picking all day long. And these companies are putting out these diversity annual reports, which are fueling a lot of the interest in computing itself. The tech industry itself is saying that we don't have enough women, we don't have enough people of color, we don't have enough Hispanics, we don't have enough black people, we don't have enough Latinx, we don't have enough Native Americans, et cetera. And all of them basically are saying the same thing. But the arithmetic is such that they can't all win at the same time. Apple is opening up and expanding in Austin, as you well know if you live here. Google is doubling its size in New York. They're expanding into Boulder. Amazon is going into DC, 50,000 people. So if those proportions are to extend and go up, they can't all win at the same time. Therefore, the answer has to be in the capacity itself. So let me conclude this logic. A citizen in the modern Technopolis requires an element of computational numeracy, of analytical ability, to be able to play irrespective of the industrial sector in which they intend to work. The cities are projecting themselves as these kinds of technopolises, as you can see by the way they're courting tech companies, whether they be fintech, medtech, tech, doesn't matter. Tech is ubiquitous. Underneath that is the fundamental segregation that we're actually living in. And the relationship between that segregation, the education, and this loop that I just ranged, that's the central challenge that I see in the way that this workforce works and the way modern citizenry is ultimately going to play itself out. So let's talk. Thank you. Please. There's a questions thing somewhere. Please, but if you could, I think, yeah, please. And don't be shy with the mic. I'm up here and under bright lights, so please.
Hey, what's up? So my name is Chris Barlow. I teach computer science, high school in Portland, Oregon. And I guess one of the questions I have, when you were kind of talking about the plucking, right? I feel right now that the kind of as a corporate level, they want to pick winners in terms of programs. Like my program has a lot of success, lots of students. It's very easy for me to get funding and just kind of say like, hey, look, we're doing good. Give me more money. How do you get companies, corporations to kind of embrace that fail-forward mentality that they do with their business practices? Hey, we're going to try this out. It didn't work. That's good. And I don't feel like they apply that lens to education and funding programs to succeed in education.
Well, I think that challenge is becoming a bit more sophisticated as we go along. But you're right. I think there is the respective perspectives matter. So in many instances, the companies, depending on where the support for these programs come from, their return on investment stress is often what's driving them. So in some instances, like if it's corporate social responsibility, for example, it just means that you're demonstrating kind of goodwill and good citizenship, et cetera, but doesn't mean necessarily that you're fundamentally addressing the structure that's going on out there. In other instances, they have to do with pipeline access. So if your particular program is one that really is generating people who are eligible to be competitive for the kinds of jobs, then that would be the filter that they look at. But in many cases, what's happening is that the programmatic people who are out in the communities are just meeting a company, but they don't know where the company is coming from because it isn't clear who these people are. So there's a level of sophistication there that I think is maturing. I think there's a growing awareness that all these companies can't win at the same time. So the picking winners is for sure true. But how we discern, I think the maturity of discernment itself is something that in the research community, there's more of that. So when individual faculty are coming to the National Science Foundation, for example, often we're asking for some kind of evidence that what you're doing makes sense. Even the logic of it. If you don't have previous experience, demonstrate that your logic model is something sensible that we can respond to. But it's an iterative process for sure. Please.
So when you were talking about that, you did homework and you studied for the test and you got prepared and all that. Something that's talked about at our school is that's like you bought into the whiteness of how to succeed in a white society, which is like you doing homework and all that kind of stuff. So what is the way, is there a way to succeed that doesn't involve all of those things that made you succeed?
I don't think there's any way to succeed without doing hard work. I also don't quite ascribe to the idea that doing homework is a white thing. But
so what would you say to the people who say that doing homework is a white thing?
I tell them they're tripping. And that in order to, I mean, I don't mean to be glib about it, but I have said that. I think the idea that high aspirations and high achievement and excellence is somehow a white thing is ridiculous at its face. So the excellence is something that has nothing to do with your color, because then oftentimes what happened in New York, for example, what I would then do is find all these broke, ridiculous white people who didn't do their homework, who were failing everything, and just like they were scrubs. So like, here's evidence that the argument that you're making doesn't make any sense. But often what happens is that the way that the dialogue has gone on is it's put upon us to defend ourselves for doing well. And let me give you an example of how that works, because I'm a hybrid person, so my family is all from the West Indies. And in the Caribbean and in many parts of Africa, what you'll find in the West African countries in particular, that this whole idea of learning is honorable. And the expectation that you will learn as immigrants, period, doesn't matter where you're from. But certainly in New York, you're exposed to other black people who are not shackled to this idea that somehow excellence and high achievement and doing homework and being responsible is a white people thing, because they're coming from places where there aren't any. So we know that excellence is independent of race. And so I would make the case, particularly for those, if you're dealing with students who somehow believe that, I think you shouldn't be scared of being accused of being racist or somehow insensitive and drive that argument home directly. Because I think it's false at its premise, and I think people believe it because we're just kind of in this context and everybody's scared to say it. That said, I think that there are, of course, actual constraints that correlate with color, that correlate with class, that have to be overcome. And those things do need special considerations. But at its heart, there's no way to be successful, regardless of who you are, without the hard work. I think we all know that. So to me, I think it's an element of courage to make the case directly to people who might then say, well, we're friends, so, white man, you can't tell me that, whatever. I could tell you what I'm telling you. You back up and let me just explain to you that this is how achievement works. This is what it looks like. Hope that's helpful. Please. There's some things on here that I got to read too, but yes.
Thank you. I also teach in Portland, Oregon. Probably I should talk to Chris. I teach in a highly diverse high school, and I started to think during this conference, but before I came to see you, that we should have a coding requirement for every student in our high school, or some kind of computer science experience as a graduation requirement. And I just wanted to know what you thought about that, and what would you recommend as a goal for students before they leave, so that they can be good citizens.
Sure.
Yeah.
Before they leave high school.
Yeah.
I think, I'm all in favor of it, but I'm not unrealistic, because I think that there's a finite amount of time in a teacher's day. So I think that we're treating a lot of these add-ons as if it's not a zero-sum game. So there does have to be some sacrifice made. If you're going to add some requirement has to be removed. And that requires the adjudication of the system, per the needs of the student, the particular challenges that your school faces, and so on. So one of the things that I would suggest with that is that I don't agree that these large-scale mandates make sense. And the challenge that I have with that is it runs me into the argument, basically, of the relationship between states' rights and federal government oversight. Because states' rights have not been kind to black people. But the argument about it in this case, to me, is at least reasonable. Like, you have to best understand what the requirements in your school and what your school is capable of doing. And it shouldn't necessarily be a mandate that you have to do it. But that said, I think that there's a discussion to certainly be had. And then to the point that was made earlier, there's a whole host of ways to go about doing that. But there it requires some discernment and dialogue with people who are funding it, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a place for it, for sure. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for the great talk. So this problem of the practical issue that teachers do understand the importance of coding, and they do want to bring it into schools, but then when you think about how much time they have during the school and what they're accountable for, there's just simply not enough time. That is something that I've heard many, 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 many times during my practice of working with teachers. And one of the things that I've been trying to think is, what are the number of hours that children are awake, and how do they spend that? And obviously they spend like certain hours in schools, and then there's this 3-4 hours between school and by the time their parents come home. And that percentage of children that they will that they have two parents working is increasing. And if you look at the after-school programs, the need for after-school program, the unmet need is twice as much as the number of students that are actually currently enrolled. And a lot of these families that they want to have access to after-school, they just simply don't have that access. And one thing that we could focus on is thinking about how can we use those 3 hours in a productive way to tackle and also introduce these coding concepts or STEM concepts or soft skills that are important for the future during those hours. So not trying to put everything in 9 to 3, but how can we use those 3-4 hours in between the two? Can you tell me what are the opportunities in terms of federal policies or different opportunities focusing on after school rather than school, and how those programs could help teachers and schools to actually expand their offerings?
There are an array of programs, both federal and state, that deal with informal after school, that block of hours that you're talking about, because for all the reasons that you just laid out, it's a critical period of time for so many students, particularly those who are unsupervised during that time. The After School Alliance in DC is one of those that kind of agencies, nonprofit organizations that tries to rally understanding of what the pedagogies should or shouldn't be, what kind of funding is necessary to make them rigid, because one of the things that they often suffer from is the temporal nature of the people who volunteer. So it's so inconsistent.
Yeah.
So I think as a staged matter, I think one of the things that is, and none of this is new, but one of the things that needs to be done first is to make the capacity of those institutions more reliable, so that when students go, their expectations of who will be there and what will be done is standardized. And then from there, you can decide what you want to put on that strengthened capacity. But there are a whole host of agencies, organizations, United
Sure.
Way, and so on and so forth that are trying to address that.
Can we think of that as a way to include this computer science coding? So instead of putting all the professional development and all the weight on teachers during the day, can we think about new programs to actually bring volunteers from companies or even teachers to use those hours that are actually trained, not really think of a passing time, but think of those hours as very important time that professionals need to be with our students to teach them these codings and these STEM learning skills?
Yeah, we can for sure. There are a lot of, there's suites of tools for that kind of work. So there's no question that that is an option, and people are pursuing it for sure. There are a lot of organizations like Code.org, Black Girls Code, Girls Who Code. I mean, it's code dot everything. And so, but my only suggestion here is that when you're trying, if you're a teacher or a local leader, when you're trying to engage in things like that, the platform upon which those things sit, you have to be sure that it's strong. Otherwise, I think it can do more harm than good.
Okay.
Like if you're encouraging students to learn something, but the place in which you're encouraging them to learn it doesn't work, then they'll be turned off by the subject, mismatching the experience with the subject itself. And I think computing is particularly vulnerable to that, because on its face, it's kind of treated as this kind of mystical thing that I don't want to do, it's too hard, and so on and so forth. So therefore, I think it's very important to be cautious about the infrastructure that you're embedding that upon.
Awesome.
Please.
Thank you.
Indeed. Sure. I got to check one of these things, too. Please, Josh.
Hey, Kamau, thank you so much. As always, great. Couple of questions. One, I'm just going to say who I am and want to put in a quick pitch for play. And
Wait.
Wait?
On the pitch part, we don't have that much time, so
Okay.
just quick on the question.
Okay, thank you. Include play in computer science and any learning. That's it for the pitch.
Okay.
Are there models of the TEALs, for example, or others that you think are particularly promising for ways to get other expertise besides teachers into computing or other STEM classrooms?
There are. So the question really is about expanding the pool of teachers to people who have these skills in other ways. So the TEALS program, for those of you who don't know, is a Microsoft program where it has Microsoft employees volunteer to go and supplement teachers in schools. They have several hundred around the country. There too, its limiting factor is the number of people who have the volunteerism. Google has similar kinds of programs called Googlers in Residence, so they go out and teach in various schools. So I think that those models work in their capacity, but the limiting factor still is the people. Are there enough of them? There's an opportunity cost for people who are professionals to go out into schools because they're not doing their professional job at the time. So there's a lot of altruism involved in that. But I do think still that they can be effective conduits of this kind of information and role models. I mean, all the arguments that they typically give, I think that there's an opportunity for some of that to be effective. But there too, it has to be in concert with institutions, schools that have the capacity to absorb them. Because another adult in a classroom can be very disruptive. So you need to have the core teacher be facile enough to be able to navigate that so that it's not disrupting the education that's going on there. So I think there is a way for it. Let me, in these 30 seconds, this Slido, there are an array of questions here, but one of them is often the strategies and funding for school reform are controlled by the people in positions of power, and those correlate with the kind of, I gather what the parenthetic clause there is that the people who are in positions of power are also those who are kind of raised to the top of the segregational ladder. And how do we answer this as citizens? So that's a philosophical question about breaking the whole order of things. But what I would say to that, though, is I think there's an interesting part of this experience that I think is perhaps tangential, but in my head, they're connected. In all of these schools that I've been to, universities, I've been to all the high schools in Atlanta, et cetera, and several around the country. What's interesting about it at the moment is that somehow the culture of being a student right now, particularly in the STEM space, is not an activist posture. So they are just kind of taking what we're giving them and not advocating on their own behalf. And I think that that part is dangerous. We saw the Parkland thing with the shooting and so on because it was one moment that was kind of grand in time. But I think generally speaking, the amount of resources that are going after STEM education, the students themselves are often just operating like sheep. And there, I think, is central to this problem. Like the student activation, the student mobility, the student sense of agency to be able to control their own destiny is something that can be translated into the way that we upend this kind of power imbalance. So that said, thank you very much for having me. This is a real pleasure.